everyone, and welcome to SIRDCAST. This is episode number 3 with Sergeant First Class retired Ross Andrews. I'm super excited about this one. Ollie is my co-host. Ollie Fisher, how are you this afternoon or this morning? Over my time is
Very
this morning.
well, ready to go. Looking forward to hear the lovely stories from Ross, who I never met, but I heard a lot of stories from you. So let's go.
All right. So, Ross, just thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Not a problem.
All right, so small introduction. Ross is now the owner of Blue Ocean Strategies LLC management consulting firm. Ross is a former U.S. Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps Music Committee founder and leader. He was also a music arranger, librarian, historian, and also snare drum section leader. So Ross, I know from my seat, I just have to say thank you for all of the inspiration you've given me throughout the years, whether you knew you were inspiring me or not. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that.
I know there's lots of folks that, they think they associate this name Andrews also with another infamous guy named Petney and this crazy drum solo called The Adventures of Joe 90, which I know a lot of the listeners here are very familiar with. But I think your story is a lot deeper than just obviously one drum solo and goes into kind of a life of fifing and drumming, kind of growing up as a kid. Could you start off with just giving us a little bit of a background of your history in drumming or music or however that starts?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate this. It's been healthy for me to kind of remember these things. My time of life, you get busy, and it's very easy to forget. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this information. But no, I grew up in a tiny little town in northern Vermont, up by the Canadian border. It was a ski town. It was a lot like Switzerland. Actually, it's very isolated. When you have tourist industry in town, nobody has a full-time job. You work the ski areas, you chop wood. It's very hard. It's a very hard way to make a living. Beautiful country, very hard to work, and it's very hard to get out of that kind of living. So I think that's a good way to preface things. And my dad was a big influence for me. He was a salesman, but he was also in the National Guard. So he was the local commander. He was a colonel. He took his company to Vietnam and took them back safely. But he had high standards for my brother and my sister and I, and that would come back to in good use kind of throughout my life. But the funny thing is that he played clarinet when he was in high school, and he thought it was really important that all of us kids play an instrument. And so in 5th grade, when it's that time to pick an instrument, I said, I want to play drums. And he said, you're not playing drums, you're going to play a musical instrument. So I had to play trombone. You didn't want any drummers in the house. You wanted musicians. So there I was in 5th grade playing an instrument I hated, and I was terrible, and I never practiced. And at the same time, school never worked for me. I was in a beautiful place of the country. I wanted to get home. I wanted to go outside. I wanted to fish. I wanted to hunt. I wanted to read. School didn't work for me. At that time, I certainly didn't know anything about, international anything. It was just a really kind of an idyllic life. And in 7th grade, I was at school, and we had a man come and give a presentation. Mandatory presentation. Everybody has to show up, and that man's name was Gerd Summer. And Gerd Summer was a drummer, and he was starting a fife and drum corps for the American Bicentennial in 1976. So this is 7th grade for me. And he played the rudiments, and the presentation was in a library, and it was very loud, and it was wonderful. And I was like, this is amazing. And he was, if you want to learn how to play the drums, lessons are free. come on Thursday nights. And so I went home, and my dad knew that trombone was not working. And so sure enough, he let me play the drums or go to lessons. Now, Gerd Summer was one of the only remaining students of J. Burns Moore. Um, and so, uh, and he was very strict. A matter of fact, when we talk about lessons, we had to not only learn all 26 rudiments, but we had to pass them before we ever saw a drum, before we were ever allowed to march, before we ever learned a song. So you had to pass all the rudiments. Which isn't very sexy. You'd much rather be out there making noise on a drum, and that took me a while. It was hard, and I wasn't really into it. My parents made me practice, and in that organization, in Hannaford's Volunteers, which was the Fife and Drum Corps he created, when you were learning, you had to pull the cannon in parades, which was heavy, and Vermont has a lot of hills. So it was hard work.
I think
And
probably Child Protective Services may have something to say about that.
I know, right? It's so funny. So there's stories there, but so there I am pulling the cannon, and I did this for well over a year, if not 2 years, dragging through my lessons, not really into it, pulling a cannon, and then we went to a battle reenactment, and this was really. Looking back on it now, this was really important. So a battle reenactment is when your fife and drum unit is encamped with infantry soldiers reenacting, history. In this case, the American Revolution. And drummers are very important in camp life. They beat the calls for getting water, for waking up, for everything. And the louder you played, the better. And so at that time, I was there with who I thought was the best drummer in the entire world. His name was Cole Tierney, and he was also in my Fife and Drum Corps, and he taught me how to play all of these calls.
Huh.
And so, as I'm doing this calls, and you had to play the calls while you were running through a field. I mean, you really had to be adept at carrying a drum and beating it, and then at night we would play the dancing music, and the better the drummer, the more popular you were with the girls. They'd want to come and dance and play the songs, and so that really lit a light bulb for me. I was like, oh, now I get it. And from that time, now I'm in 8th grade now. Okay, if not, it's this, maybe even the summer before high school. Okay, I never stopped practicing after that. My hands were bloody from practicing. I beat the dashboard off my parents' car from practicing. And I practiced instead of doing my homework. I even snuck music paper into my binders at school so I could write music when I was in school. So anyway, so this is high school, right? Uh, I think that's enough before we get on to the next question, but you kind of get a stage for where I was at. I was, finally playing a drum. I got it. Everything was clicking. And it was, that really set the stage for the future Ross Andrews.
That's amazing. I love it.
So and then how did you end up with the old guard? How did it work? I mean, you were in 8th grade. You were a fascinated drummer, but so how was that these days?
So that's a great story. So the Fife and Drum Corps that I was in would go to Fife and Drum musters. So we would go down to Connecticut a couple times a year. And at one of these musters in 1978, I saw the Old Guard for the first time. I hadn't known it, but I had also seen them in 1973 when my family was visiting, and we saw Twilight Tattoo at the Jefferson Memorial. But it didn't make an impact. I didn't know who it was or anything like that. But anyway, so I saw them in 1978, and I knew right then that was it. That's what I was going to do, and I just couldn't think of anything else. And I actually ended up auditioning after a muster in 1980. So now I was 16 years old, and Cole was 15, and we both auditioned, and we were terrible. And we got sent home with what to practice and how to hold the sticks and some music and all that kind of stuff. but somehow through I probably through Gerd Summer, I met a man named Robin Hallweedle, and Robin Hallweedle was a policeman in the town where I grew up. He had also been in the old guard. He was in from 1972 until 1975, and he was a snare drummer. And he had music that he gave me, and he kind of told me how, what kind of a job it was, and more about how to get in. And he was really influential. So that fall, I ended up talking my recruiter into flying me down to Washington D.C. For an interview, and that was a now we're talking November of 1980, and I was terrible, and I didn't pass the snare audition, but I did pass a bass audition. And so I came back, and 2 days before Christmas in 1980, I went down to the MEP station in Keene, New Hampshire, and raised my hand and went on delayed enlistment because I was going to be joining the Army after I graduated from high school. Okay, now, as I said before, I didn't do school. I didn't like it. I was terrible at it. I was sneaking in practicing instead of going to school. And I got called into the principal's office in January of 1981 and was told I'm not going to graduate because I didn't have enough credits. And I had like a 1.3 GPA or something like that. And this is a problem because I was on delayed enlistment, and it was the Stripes for Skills program. And without a high school diploma back then, I wasn't going in the band. I was going in the infantry.
Yep.
So, so I was in a pickle, and my principal at the time, who happened to be a World War II veteran, kind of understood what was the old guard was, and he actually ended up waivering me out of high school. So that's my never have you ever question. If you ever play Never Have You Ever, I never technically graduated from high school because I didn't pass the requirements.
You are saying that now very funny and with a smile, but I'm sure on that time this was quite a challenge for you and a difficult situation. And lucky you had this support from your surroundings to have that possibility.
Absolutely. Oh, I can't imagine, right? And I was, the local hero in the papers and all this kind of stuff, going to the presidential escort. So it would have looked bad for the school also if, they kept me from going, right? So I really had them over a barrel, and I'm very fortunate that that it worked out the way it did. So that was, and it's a funny story, but Brian Petney did something very similar. Neither one of us were going to college.
Okay.
So if we didn't make it in the old guard, I don't know where we'd be.
Yeah, but how anyway? I mean, I was in 2014 invited by Mark, and I saw the old guard now, who is very famous. But how was it in the 80s to be the old guard? I'm sure it was different.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I joined in 1981, okay, there was 20 vacancies. There's 20 open positions because they had grown the core for the bicentennial, and then everybody got out because nobody reenlisted back then. And this is really important. Okay, so Brian and I joined with 18 other new people, and like Brian and Tony Hawksworth, they were all big, so they protected me. So we kind of got away from the old Army and the hazing and all of the bullying that happened back then and the bad attitudes, because we all joined at the same time. And we were all excited. We wanted to be there. But interestingly, Brian Petney and I were the only two people to join from Fife and Drum Corps. Everybody else came from other bands. They came from the School of Music. And so we were, we kind of found each other and was like, okay. So we ended up practicing together. And remember, I was playing bass drum. I didn't like bass drum. It was too heavy. I wanted to play snare drum. So I was still practicing every day. And this is really important. So Brian and I are practicing, okay, in our rooms. And one of the things I forgot to mention earlier in Vermont is that one of the things that is not in Vermont is there's no music stores. There's no other bands. We didn't have any music. I had memorized the company books.
Huh.
We didn't have anything else to play. So I started writing music when I was in high school just to challenge us. So we had something more to do.
Right.
So when I joined the old guard, the music wasn't very good there either. So I kept writing. And so Brian and I, Brian would play we'd work with each other, and we had a lot of fun. Well, this ended up, we ended up with a couple of fifers, Alan Reed and Charlie Morris and Tim Lewis, and we snuck practice in the middle of the night and on weekends, because back then, if they caught you playing fife and drum music, you'd be disciplined. That wasn't allowed. You could practice the core music or nothing.
Wow.
And
I guess, Mark, definitely a change to today, yeah?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so we called this the Ancient Underground. And we would meet. We were going to have patches made, and Cole Tierney ended up joining the unit shortly after me, and then his sister joined. And so we had this little cohort group who would sneak in practicing, and we would we paid our own way to go to Westbrook, to play there, and we wrote our own music and played it. So we had this thing going on, okay, behind the scenes.
I love it, because now there's actually the Ancient Underground in Basel with the American style course in Switzerland, and they all get together. So we're gonna have to do some kind of meeting of the minds at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so funny. So as we're doing this, time progresses, and my first enlistment of 3 years was up, and I passed my audition for snare. And so, but in order to move into the snare drum slot, I had to re-enlist. Okay. And at the same time, Brian had gotten promoted to section leader, or was in the process of it. So he re-enlisted, and some other people re-enlisted, but a lot of people got out. And the reason they got out was because the music was boring. Okay. We didn't change the music. Back then, the section leaders and the group leaders controlled what music was played. Okay. And so if you didn't change the music, you didn't have to practice.
Yep.
Yep.
And so that was a big issue, is that, the people who were there stayed there, and they really kept other people from staying there. Okay. And so, meanwhile, we still have our little group, and Brian and I were writing music together. This is where Joe 90 came from, is that we were doing this. We wrote Joe 90 on a trip in San Antonio, and we beat the heck out of an iron board. I think Brian shredded that thing.
Oh, sure.
But we were doing a lot of writing on trips, so nobody would catch us.
Interesting. Yeah.
So because we had to sneak these things in. So now that kind of leads into the next question I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was something too. I mean, I would say I didn't know the component of how many slots were open at that time, but it makes sense with the bicentennial being the expansion of the Corps. There's slots open. I'm sure there was some maneuvering of people that they were going to maybe downsize a little bit afterwards. And I think there was some discussion about, when the Corps was founded in 1960, nobody really had the option to re-enlist, because I think they said that you would go to Vietnam immediately.
Yes.
So,
Not until 1971. That's true.
Okay. So I find that fascinating, because whether it's coincidence or however it lays out, there always seems to be almost this kind of renaissance of the Corps almost every 20 years. So 1960 to 1980, 1980 to 2000, 2000 to 2020, which is where we're at now. We have a slew of openings coming over the next few years that started about a year and a half ago. And it's weird to watch this, but that new crop of folks, just like you're explaining, they start writing the new chapters of the Corps' history almost in these 20-year increments, which is, I think, so fascinating here. Your story of how it came in, the music that was being played, because I think for all of us, that's the catalyst of why we decide to join the Old Guard, is we see this obviously amazing marching unit history, but the music is always what grabs us. Right. And I know when I joined, that was that kind of battle back and forth too of, are we going to just keep playing the same old stuff, or are we going to create something new? And I think really what happened is you set the groundwork for what I saw as the music library / production staff. But I know it the story and why it happened is very interesting. So could you go into that a little bit?
Sure, I'd love to. And I've already set the stage, right? Is that we have these young upstarts writing music and practicing, and so we were kind of looked suspiciously on, right? But so I don't know, I can't remember what happened, but somehow I got it in my head. I think it might have even been from talking to my father about this problem. And, he being an officer saying, well, the bandmaster is the one who's in charge of the music. And so I went and knocked on the door. And back then, you didn't knock on the door without going through the NCO Corps to find out why you're going to go talk to the bandmaster. And I went and talked to the bandmaster myself, which could have ended very badly. But we had a conversation, and morale was low. A lot of people were getting out. The music was terrible. And I said, that's your responsibility. You have to do something about this. And I'm willing to help you. I had told them that we were practicing in secret and we had good morale, from all the people who were part of that were staying in and reenlisting. And he bit, and he gave me a committee. This is 1989. Wow. And and with that, one of the things that I had recommended that he went through with was that we required people in the organization to pass a musical test for their annual review. Okay, and so for some of these people, this was a problem because they couldn't sight read.
Yeah.
Or they just couldn't play, to the standards that were required. And so, that's one of the, unfortunate things that happened is that some people had to retire early. They had to leave the organization. But he also allowed me to pick from the best people in the organization for this music committee to write music and drill. And the way it worked back then is that as a compromise, that music would then still go before the NCO Corps, who would vote on it, right, and decide whether or not to go forward. But for all intents and purposes, things had changed at that point, and we had a young group. And this is, the first music committee was Brian and I. It was Tony Hawksworth, Lonnie Johnson, Kirk Wilkie, Susan Brockman, some real big influencers in the Corps. And it was a dream team. We couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. We stayed late. We just absolutely loved it. And the first thing we did was change the sequences and that sort of thing. But if you look back and I have the data on this, which I think is fascinating. If you go back to 1989 and you go to the current day, everybody started staying in. We didn't have the turnover. You didn't have the 70% turnover every 3 years. Now, all of a sudden, everybody stayed in because now the standards were high. Everybody had to meet the standards, right? And it was challenging. People were challenged by the music. And so now you're in a situation where people stayed in more than they got out. And it was a real change in the structure of the Corps. And Mr. Alvarez, who was the bandmaster at the time, unfortunately came down with cancer about that same time. And he ended up passing away. And now he was the sergeant major first before he became the bandmaster. So he had been there in charge since the early 70s. And now with him gone, we had to start getting bandmasters from outside the unit.
Okay. What year would that have been?
1992, I think Mr. Alvarez left. It was right in there somewhere. But anyways, we got Mr. Campbell. Steve Campbell was our first bandmaster, who's living in Arizona now, and we still stay in touch. And he was phenomenal. He showed up to the first rehearsal with a baton, and he tried to conduct us. And that sounded like a herd of cats falling down the stairs because nobody knew what a baton was or how to be conducted. But he was a real influence early on in setting that standard and keeping the standards high. And then he was followed by Chief Warrant Officer Jeannie Pace, who ended up staying 43 years in the band system and retired in 2005. She's a legend. But anyway, so you get the picture, right? Is that the standards were set. Now musicianship was part of your annual review. The music standards were high, and it really helped with morale and retention.
But it's also a lot of organization and leadership, what I understand, who made this musical effort, set up standards and have a mission. So when you mentioned 3-4 times awful music, awful repertoire. So what was the big difference then? I mean, of course, I know, for example, Joe 90, who is still today a big hit. Like everyone needs to have a hit who's going for Universal, so that's good. But how would you describe that? What was the difference with your group?
That's a great question. Thank you, Ollie. So the solos, the instrumentals that each group played, those changed from year to year, but the rest of the music did not. We were still playing, the same music that they were playing in 1960, pretty much, and it led to this imbalance, right? When you had a really progressive instrumental, by this very traditional, surrounded by this very traditional music. And so one of the challenges was that we wanted to keep it historic. We wanted to new music, but we wanted historical new music.
Authentic.
And as the librarian, I had some tools at my disposal. We had a melody encyclopedia. It was a microfiche, and you could look up a song by the tune, by the notes, and you could find where those notes happened before in history, and you could research the history of a song. And so that's where we got Simple Gifts from, is that although it was written in the 1800s, the melody is much older than that. And a lot of times that was the case, is that melodies were borrowed from previous generations and given a new name. So by doing that, we were able to date some music, and we came up with some really, really interesting arrangements. And I'll get to that in a minute when we talk about songwriting. But there was a real interest in discovering new things, right? And to show off our capabilities, with triple tonguing with the fifes, and just really being able to take pride in what we were doing in every song.
So that was an interesting segue there too, because I know that this type of kind of metamorphosis, if you will, takes time. So from, like you were saying, it was starting around like 1989. When you came out with your first, what you felt was a complete project. I mean, how many was it? A few years? How long did this process?
It was. We started with the sequences. Our White House arrival sequence and those kind of things. And then I think that our first SOA was probably Spirit of America show was probably 91 or 92. It's hard. We were traveling a lot then. I was at the top of my career, and it was very busy. And so it's hard to remember all this. But somebody like Brian probably would remember more than me, but I think it was them.
I find it really interesting because from my point of view, I remember the day that it was the 1993 tape that came out.
Right.
And I remember hearing that for the first time, driving with my father in Millbrook, New York, to the Young Fusiliers muster in the middle of Millbrook, New York, and hearing Swallow's Tale, Rob Roy McIntosh, and like all of it was this, Barren Rocks of Eden, this traditional fife and drum tunes that were there, and the drumming to this and the arrangement of it was, to this day, it is still my number one favorite fife and drum recording out there.
Me too.
Jim Clark and Connecticut Valley Field Music are like right up there. Like I love both of those recordings, but I remember like as growing up as a kid, hearing that tape was a game changer for what I thought fife and drum could be.
And we were having so much fun. You just
amazing.
Can't imagine. It was you just couldn't wait to wake up in the morning and get to work so you could start playing this stuff. It was just magical.
Congratulations for changing a young boy's life with that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think for me as from abroad, when I look at it, it's unique. You have a very specific style, And what I liked, and that was actually my questions also to that secret, because normally we have the tendency, especially the drummers or rhythm section, if you are strong and you want to lift up the standards, it gets only louder and quicker. So the pace is quicker and it's more artistic. So it has to be more technical. And for me, and that's also something what I really appreciate by you, Mark, the style of the musician, it's really music, to try to be a full instrument. Maybe it's because, like Ross, you said, it's not a proper instrument. We always have this legacy that we have to be better conductor, better musicians as drummer than every flute player or piano player, because we have to prove ourselves. And that's actually also one question I had to you, because that's my experience in my army life. If you are so inspirational, if you are so successful, I'm sure there was also a lot of attention from your officers, from the old guards, from the regiment, to say, so what's going on there and why they are so successful. And maybe you also took a little bit the show or the time of these shows. So how was that? Was that easy, or was that a gift? Everyone said, wow, excellent. We all were sleeping for many years now.
It was hard. Remember, we the group that I hung around with, we weren't well liked.
See, I knew it.
I think that it's probably a little bit about my personality. I don't go and confront people. I just do it. And so for some people, having this amount of change in the organization, was scary. They weren't in the same place musically that we were, and so here's these young people pushing the organization forward, and it wasn't shared. I think by especially through the leadership. It was just something that they had to manage, and so. Writing music, and kind of getting into that side of it. You have to remember that this is something I had been doing since I first learned how to play, and so it was just part of playing is writing, and one of the things that this is actually a really kind of funny story, and I think that your audience will really appreciate this. But something happened in this time period that was remarkable. We had a number of international trips in the early '90s, Belgium, and I was on the first one and didn't make the second or third one, and so my name on the roster was I was next to go when there was an international trip. And so in 1994, we got orders to support the Royal Tournament in London, which was a tattoo that had been going on for a long time. And we were to send 2 drummers from the Old Guard and 2 drummers from the Army Band, and to join 13 other NATO countries at this tattoo. And so I got picked. And Dave Knoll and I ended up going. He was a bass drummer at the time, and we didn't have anybody else, so he ended up going and playing snare, and we were there for a month. So when I was there, you remember this is 1994. I met a really good friend to this day. His name is Eric Yoekling. He was in the Norwegian Guard, and Eric, in 1994 in Norway, they just had the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer. So just so happens in January of 1994, that's when my daughter was born. And so I was on leave. I was on baby leave, as we call it, in January, and I got to watch the entire Olympics. It was really memorable. I got to watch the whole thing, the opening ceremony, and I loved the music. If you ever get a tape of that, it was absolutely amazing music. Well, so here I meet somebody who was there. He was performing in that. And he found out that I really liked it. So when we got home, he sent me the CD of that score. And one of the songs was played in a church, and it had a lot of organ, a lot of pipe organ, and a lot of really busy drumming. And so I took this CD into the music committee, and we played it. And Kirk Wilkie and Susan Brockman and I ended up using that to write the Simple Gifts show.
Mm.
The Simple Gifts show is what you guys played at the Basil Tattoo.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that song that comes out of the drum solo with all those long chords and the backsticking and the 30-second notes, that's where it came from.
That's
it came from Eric Jokling in Norway.
So Eric, if you're listening to this, thank you very much.
Yeah, he's been great. He keeps sending me T-shirts and drumsticks, and he has his own band, a Chick Corea tribute band that he's still playing, and he's very successful. Wow. But anyway, so I thought that was really funny. So now we're starting to get this, this international influence in our writing. But that was probably our high watermark. Was that show? It was our favorite show. It had so much energy, and that's why it really started to take on this international influence.
But I love it too, because you started talking to me, I think this has got to be over a decade ago, and we were talking about arranging and things like that. And one of the things I thought was always very interesting was when you would write, you would still use a lot of traditional elements, but the placement of how you would put the rudiment in the phrase was unique. And I think that really inspired me quite a bit. And I would listen to that 93 tape, and I would listen to Jim Clark's writing with Middlesex County Volunteers.
And he was a big influence for me too. I was playing all of his stuff.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
So, yeah, the Connecticut Yanks, they were huge.
Right.
Huge influence.
That makes sense. You know what? I never really put that together. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had that album memorized.
So, I mean, if you look at it, it's kind of this interesting amalgamation of, your writing, you're growing up at Hannaford's, having the right timing with Brian and Susan and Lonnie and Kirk and all these folks. But then you were bringing stuff from outside of the old guard and bringing it into the old guard, which is, I think, from a leadership point of view, that's something I know I ran into quite a bit. Was there were folks who said, if I make it to the old guard, everything is going to live and die, be the old guard, the old guard, the old guard. And there's no organization that is able to provide all of the needs for a person. And I think that's something that a lot of us, when we're younger, we look to be a part of some kind of community, some kind of, in relationship with friends and everything else, a professional environment, a growth environment. We're looking for all of these things to happen. And what I feel like has been very successful from your story is you were taking a piece of your history growing up, where you currently are, and analyzing where you think it could be or should be, or where can it be, and then what do we need to do to make it get there? And I feel like you're already creating this idea of team building very early on, and you're able to see it in a very unique way. So, I mean, do you feel like that music committee experience was kind of the jettison or the launch pad for how you started to build teams or things like that?
Yeah, I want to back up just a little bit. Remember Gerd Summer and his dedication to those rudiments, and you couldn't get a drum until you learned all the rudiments. That was a very high standard, right? And what it did is it kept unqualified people out of the organization. You had to know your stuff, and we had a dedication to bringing the rudiments into this non-fife and drum organization at the time. But remember, Hannaford's, from this tiny little town by the Canadian border, put 5 musicians into the old guard. It was me, then Cole Tierney, then his sister, then Kathy Mullen, then Matt Tourville, because of the standards, right? Is that everybody had to meet that standard. So I think when we're talking about teams, that's probably the one thing that I love more than music, because what I've come to realize is the potential of teams. And before we start talking about teams, everybody hears that word and they're like, "Oh yeah, I know what a team is," but it's a very specific scientific definition. Like organizational psychologists in the 40s and 50s studied this, and they figured out that you can't manage more than 5 people. Nobody can. It's impossible, because you can't influence more than that number of people. I mean, you can impact people, right? You as a sergeant major can cancel everybody's leave, and that'll have an impact, right? But you're not going to influence anybody for character. And so that's really important, is this idea of a team being 5 or 6 people and no more. That's an Army squad. That's the foundation of our military. The military is just a hive of teams.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of sense.
And that's probably one of the most important things. And then you've got a squad leader. That team leader is the most important person in the military. Is the most important person in any company. Okay. So when we're talking about and this is why organizational charts don't work. You can't have a leader, Richard Branson or somebody, in the cafeteria getting in front of 2,000 people every morning and motivating them. It doesn't work like that. Yeah. Okay. This is one of the reasons why we have such chronic depression and problems with people leaving the military. Okay. It's not because they're leaving the military, they're leaving their team.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And so teams are absolutely important. And with the old guard, and like with a lot of international musical organizations, we're not just talking about a team, we're talking about a high performing team. Okay. And that high performing team is a team, that has the high standards, right? The SEALs, Special Forces, we share more in common with them than we do with the rest of the military being in the old guard, because you've got to be resilient. You've got to be able to trade off leadership. If somebody can't make it, something changes, which happens all the time. You've got to be able to be resilient and kind of self-healing on a team. Okay. Well, you can't do that without those high standards and without that leadership, that kind of leadership that where you're giving of yourself because you're investing in someone else. Okay, that's why you can only have 5 people. You can't. There's no time in the day. This works with families.
Yeah. You want to raise a family.
It's the same way.
Now I understand, Mark, why you have invited him and how instrumental he was. Ross, you're talking like my old Swiss Army instructors,
right?
And I like that you make this Navy SEALs and this on, because that's exactly what we're saying. You need to have you're always in action. You're not rehearsing for something. And I think you brought it to the point. It's resilience and basics with the rudiments. And this is now really for me an eye-opener again to see that it is a universal mindset. A universal mindset on to be successful. And I'm sure you learned that as well in your job, what you just mentioned, because that's key on every successful enterprise.
It is. And I think that, one of the, the last thing I'll say about teams, and I'll answer that question, is that teams, I have a saying that you can't steer a parked car. You've got to be moving. The team has to be moving forward, and that means that people in the team all need an opportunity to lead, to test themselves, to grow. And if your leader of the team never leaves, that doesn't happen. And a lot of organizations end up dying because of that, and they don't even know it. Right? Is that one of the hardest parts of leadership, and the hardest thing to do is you have to leave. You've got to give other people the opportunity to be a leader. And so that, that when you're looking systemically at a lot of organizations who just aren't moving forward and they're not growing, that's a lot of the times why, because the people in it are on blocks. They're not moving. They're not, and you can't steer that. And like I said before about people leaving, people don't leave organizations. They leave managers. They leave people, right? And you can't be the reason, that happens. And that is what I do a lot in my current job. Okay, is I look at things like that, and I look at, why do organizations not grow? Because that's what I do, is I help organizations grow. And one of the biggest reasons that they don't grow is that they don't provide incentives for the right thing. Okay. And if you have a leader and you can look with your metrics and you can see, hey, everybody in that team leaves. Okay. Now, if you use an incentive and you say, we're going to give promotions and we're going to give bonuses to the people who can retain people, now all of a sudden the light bulb comes on, and now you're focusing on the right things. You're focusing on building the team, developing the team so that they don't leave, because that's so important. You can't grow if people leave. And so if you're growing the team, and you've got incentives in the right place, that's really the secret. And it doesn't matter whether it's a government contracting company or it's a military organization or something like that. You build an organization by building teams and making teams that nobody ever wants to leave. You can repurpose that team. You can take that team and move it to another mission. All right. But you want your teams to be high functioning and with high standards and good leadership. And that is exactly how things work. We saw that in the music committee. We saw that with the Ancient Underground, right? When people were part of something and they felt like they were contributing and they had something there, that made them want to come to work every morning, they don't leave.
Yeah, I think
and so that to me is a huge part of what I do now, and what I really enjoy doing, is looking at more of those organizational issues, and trying to diagnose where a problem is. And 9 times out of 10, it's at the team level is where the problem is.
I find it interesting because when you were discussing the Navy SEALs and the musician side of things, I was listening to a different podcast recently that was discussing the term deep work.
Yes.
And I thought that was fascinating because now in culture, your success is really built on how well you manage multiple things, sometimes very poorly because you're spread so thin that deep work is very difficult. But they brought up the idea of musicians being really the code crackers for deep work, because if you were a musician and you have a recital coming up, you could spend literally 5, 6, 7 hours, 8 hours in a practice room with just like meal breaks, but you're working on your 4-mallet marimba solo, or you're working on your snare drum etude, and you are invested in the goal for those 8 hours, trying to just accomplish the task of being prepared for this one recital. And
Right.
they said most people just don't have the mental capacity to have that level of focus for that long. And so I thought that was interesting, seeing how, building teams, creating a team, watching how you were as a musician looking at what you saw in the old guard, what the old guard could be, building this team on the music committee, finding success in that music committee. And then honestly right now too, you have this position as the alumni president for the old guard Fife and Drum Corps.
Right.
And it's, again, I almost feel like people draw these types of situations to their person. If they're that kind of person, they find other like people. They start to find something they're passionate about, and all of a sudden you start connecting. And there's this magic of, well, that a team could exist here. How do we put these right people not on the bus, but the right seat on the bus? Do they have the right equipment to be on that part of the seat of the bus? And I mean, I feel like that's what I always gain from you, is you have this ability to hyper focus on a very specific, but then the ability to Google Earth it and pull completely out and look at the macro as well as the micro.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just thinking about all of this. I don't know. I was born this way, but I do what I love, and I've always done that, and I don't really care if I flunk school, or any of these kind of things. I just do the right thing. I do the thing that makes me come alive, and that attracts other people. Right? Is that I'm in charge of me. That's really all I can control. And it's when you try to force it and you try to make people do things, that's where everything falls apart. Is do what you love, and you'll find other people that do what they love. And that's really, and think about the music committee. I got to go out and pick the people that I saw that loved things as much as I did. It wasn't like normal life where typically a manager gets assigned a team. They don't get to self-pick it.
Yep.
It's not the same. So I've been very fortunate, to have had those experiences where I was able to have that much control over what I did rather than it kind of being forced on me. And that's the life that a lot of regular military people have, is they get reassigned, and then they have to go in and they've got to influence people in such a way to build these high performing teams from scratch. So at the old guard, we really had it easy because we had everybody there already, and you could kind of go and pick that. So
I
it's a
love
good
it. I
point.
mean, we hinted on a bunch of the questions that we had, and it's funny because we tackled components of each of them, and I think the military music connection obviously is a really big one. We talked a little bit about it, but I did find very impactful that you still have these relationships with folks from across the world, even today. So I mean, when you went for that month abroad and you were there working with this probably a huge cast, I would imagine. I mean, what was that like? How was that impactful to you when you saw kind of this bigger global military music scene?
It blew me away. First of all, the conditions were horrible. They treated the horses better. I mean, we had a garden hose strung over a wall for our shower, and we were with the British Army, who drank 25 hours a day. It was something else. But you're there with other drummers, and so Eric. We were practicing. We did drum solos in the officers' mess. We were just. It was electric, absolutely electric, to see other people who I couldn't speak their language. They couldn't speak my language, but we knew the same rudiments.
Yeah.
We could play Downfall of Paris together. And this is 1994, and it was, we didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
We didn't have any of these ways of sharing like we do today. So that was a huge influence on me. Now I'm accountable not just to a national audience, but to a global audience for drumming. It wasn't just the Fife and Drum Corps Committee or Army Music. Now it was international music, and I had no idea that it even existed, to be honest with you. I didn't even know that there were other military bands.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the precursor to the internet. I mean, as soon as that happened, I think, again,
Yep.
you said you're very lucky. You show up at the old guard, you get to pick different people. When I got to the old guard, it was just the boom of social media. So whatever we were starting to do different, everyone was watching.
Wow, right. Yeah.
And it literally was, I remember 2004, I think, was my first time getting on the music writing committee, starting to put things together. And it was right as I met the folks from Top Secret.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
literally, it was Eric Juilliard and BJ McAllister kind of meeting of the minds for me of going, here's this fife and drum thing in the old guard. It's kind of modern, but it's not. It's traditional. Here is Top Secret. They want to push the limits of everything they can possibly do, but it's made up of traditional drummers. So what can we do? And I thought that was this piecing of the pie. And again, YouTube had just exploded. Facebook was exploding. MySpace was still kind of around, but like the building of social media helped really build that credibility for what we were building. And honestly, I would put a lot of that structure of the music committee of what you put together. That's what I walked into. And then we built the social media platform on top of that, which brought us to kind of where we are today.
Fascinating. Who would have ever thought?
Yeah, it's timing, right? The timing of people coming in, coming out, all of that. Yeah, Ollie, do you have anything else you want to ask?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Ross, because you underestimate a little bit. You say that you're very humble. You say, yeah, it's hard work. It's how you started. So it seems really look to me that it needs also a lot of honesty and a lot of authenticism, very authentic, to be authentic.
Yes.
And that's what for me, I mean, you say it very nice and it showed like everything was already there. But I mean, to build up that team, like you said, with this huge change, and this is really change management with you said it, to keep people along. I think that's also something we experienced globally, and we have a lot of discussion in our podcasts about education, how we bring young people
Right.
on that level. I think, and even with social media and the internet, it doesn't give us exactly that structure and the needs, or let's say the purpose. And I think that's something what for me now, as my first time I have the chance to talk to you, and for me the meaning of that, and the authenticism and the honesty about it, this is a very strong message. I think what with all the social media and the internet can boost, but it also can completely get it out of hands if you do not have that structure you just explained to us. And I think that's something for me also is a key learning from today, that you need to have this basic to build up and to move on. I think that's
Right.
key. The move on. And now for me, a little bit my last, or one of my last questions is, so you are so experienced, and you even many more years than Mark and me in this business. So how what are you doing? You're not in a veteran club, whatever, where you play the drums with old people like we do in Basel, So just a little bit slower paced. You don't look like that, but I'm sure you are very active, especially in mind. So what is your contribution, or how do you see your role now?
No, thank you. That's a good question. I unfortunately was involved in a training accident in 1998. We were running in Arlington National Cemetery, and I hit some ice, and I ended up not really knowing it at the time, but I had dislocated my pelvis. And that's kind of, when you're a drummer, that's where all your strength comes from. That's your stand.
The backbone.
Yeah, and the Army never put me back together right, unfortunately, and so I can't. I don't have any strength for playing, and so while I love the music and I love listening to it, it's very painful for me to play, which is hard. And it, that was everything. It was all I was. I had no education. All I wanted to do was drum. I wanted students. I wanted to write books. And all of a sudden, overnight, that changed, and I had to reinvent myself. And what I learned in growing up in music is that taught you leadership. Even more than music is what I learned was leadership, and that has served me well. After music, and has helped me, to help put together the alumni organization. And to really help, working with Mark and trying to find, new paths forward, as we all meet new challenges. When I think back to growing up in Vermont, I was isolated in this tiny little spot, and the only way out was through those 26 rudiments. Otherwise, I'd still be pulling a cannon somewhere. And one of the problems with social media is it seems so easy to achieve great things, but it's never easy.
No.
It's hard work. It's lonely. And one of the real risks that we face is people lowering their standards.
Yeah.
And if you lower your standards, you really don't have anything, and you can't keep a team together. It's all about the standards, and it's about individual standards. And that's what brings high performing teams together. So I try to do that in my consulting business, as I try to teach organizations how to create high performing teams, and then building an organization by building teams rather than by just hiring people. So that, it's all come together for me. I never thought, I didn't know that this was possible to make money doing what I'm doing when I was younger. But I'm very, very fortunate for all the people that I've served with, and for the experiences that I've had. And for, what is this Joe 90 thing? People are always tagging me on social media. I can't believe that people are still playing that. That's just absolutely amazing. We had no idea.
Yeah, but this is exactly what I just mentioned. It's not just only the organization, whatever. It needs the inspiration of people who are humble and authentic, And the Joe 90 is for me a good example, because when we learned that, and this is our standing repertoire, where Mark is showing small kids, old people from good drummers, and the spirit is that it's approachable. You can approach it. If you have the 26 rudiments, even when you are Chinese, and you can do the 26, and you have a little bit, at least a good boss who can do it. It's really the core. And for me, this is something. Ross, you have to give us a lecture. Huh? What do you think, Mark? In leadership and team building. So I hope you will be also part of our society group, because we're looking really for people who can tell or be successful in what they're doing and be authentic and sharing the experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's something the drummers not always are good at, because we are completely operational. But as you just mentioned, if you are well organized, and if you not always think you have to play it more quicker and louder, and you can reflect and make it as an intellectual work, I think that's also the intellect helps us enormously to be successful in the future.
Those are great points. I agree across the board.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I have to definitely say, Ross, just thank you so much for the time. What I love about this conversation is we're bringing together, active components from today, but we're deconstructing how things got to today by looking back, to your generation of time in the old guard. But what was really incredible for me was to hear your perspective of what you thought of as a new person in the Corps in 1981. Is that the right year?
Yep.
Because all of these stories that you hear, you're always hearing these third, fourth, fifth person perspectives. And quite honestly, you start to romanticize what you think the story is. And to hear the actual story I think is super beneficial, and it's uplifting because there's always challenge. And a lot of people will say, well, back then they didn't have this, but we have this now. And it was probably pretty similar to some of the same challenges.
Yeah.
There's different flavors. So I just want to say thank you for your time today. Is there anything that you feel that you'd want to share closing out?
Like I said, starting off, thank you for the opportunity. It was really healthy for me to remember all of this. I had a lot of, really, really conflicted feelings about being hurt. And I didn't make it till 20. I was separated at 19 years and 7 months. So I never got that experience of retiring and being part of all of that. So it was hard. And everything that's happened, especially with your influence, Mark, and through opportunities like this, has been really healthy for me. To feel like I still belong, to this larger organization, that I had some small, part in helping it forward. So I really appreciate you guys thinking of me and for taking the time to do this.
Well, fantastic. Because I will honestly say, I appreciate all the time you take on phone calls with me, talking through different strategies. But also, I love just to bring this back up, this idea of being a part of a team, and then all of a sudden you're not a part of a team.
Right.
And if you're a high-functioning member of a high-functioning team, and all of a sudden that's removed, we've been talking about this mentorship program, alumni associations, and all of that.
Important.
And I do believe that challenge is just not it's not a U.S. Army challenge. That's probably a high functioning team challenge, period. And maybe there's a way that we could help, other folks in other ways, whether it's drumming or music or military, and look at how mentorship programs exist. I look at this way with the old guard. You become a member at some point. It's like, wow, I'm a member. You stay a member for however long you're going to stay a member, and then you're not a member. So there's this, I'm going to be a part. I get there, I'm now a member, and then I have to leave. And there's either a positive or negative that happens there. And based on that person's experience, they take that with them and they do their next thing, or they don't do their next thing.
And that defines them for the rest of their life.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely. So, Ollie, thank you very much, my friend, for helping co-host. Ross, this has been fantastic, and I really do, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for the years of inspiration, and also now pulling the curtain a little bit away so we can see behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz a little bit.
Thanks, Mark. This was great. I really appreciate it.
All right, everyone.
Ollie, it was nice meeting you.
Pleasure. Thanks very much. Great privilege. Thank you very much.
Take care.